So hi, I am Julia Lupton, and I am interim director of the UC Humanities Research Institute, the UCHRI, which serves the 10 campuses of the University of California in order to promote research exchange and public conversations like the one that we're going to be having today. And I'm very happy to welcome you to the third and final book talk in our series entitled Refuge in Words. This series features new books by UC faculty and their colleagues, books that address refuge and forced migration from historical, cultural, artistic, and other points of view. And we'll put a link to the series in the chat, which includes recordings of our first two talks, and will eventually include a recording of tonight's talk. I'm super happy to have with me today Ignacio Lopez Calvo and Marjorie Agustin and Anne Ashbaugh. Ignacio and Marjorie are the co-editors of a new book published in 2022 by Anthem called Refugees, Refuge, and Human Displacement. And Anne wrote the lead essay called On Human Rights Across Borders, Oikeiosis and the Ethics of Sanctuary. I love this book. I am a humanist, a Shakespeare scholar, a cultural critic. And what I love about this book is the fact that the authors take such a broadly humanistic approach to refuge, paying attention not only to specific cases of forced migration and exile, but also really taking up refuge as a concept in art and putting that into dialogue with the lived experience of people who are in flight. There is a brilliant section on refuge and healing in healthcare, in the environment, and also in our university spaces. And so I found this range of approaches to be very exciting and original. And I also found it quite inspiring to see disciplines as diverse as literature, philosophy, the art of poetry, medical humanities, Jewish studies, musicology, and other fields brought into dialogue with each other. And so we're going to learn today from these three great people about the genesis of the book, its aims, and the contributions that the humanities have to make to theories and practices, creative and critical, of refuge historically and in our present moment. And so the first question is really for our editors, Ignacio and Marjorie, which is, what contribution do you expect to make to the refugee problem through your book? And I might phrase that more generally as, what do the humanities have to offer? What do the arts have to offer to a field that is often dominated by policy issues, law issues, and if the humanities enter, it's often via history.
Marjorie, you want to answer first?
Okay, so thank you, Julie, for having us, Ignacio, and I've just looked at the panelists. I want to thank all the panelists, and especially some of our contributors that are here, Yael Siman, who wrote a very moving article about the disappear of the area of Michoacan and their search for refuge as displaced families. And I want to thank Kathy Trostel, who wrote about the Venice ghetto as a space that is enclosed, but also allows to find refuge. And I really want to thank my dear friends, Joel and Liliana Rosenthal, who so generously allow us to use the cover with a lithograph, grabado, engraving of Carlos Hermosilla, Liliana's uncle, an incredible Chilean artist. And when Ignacio and I saw this picture, we were very moved, and it's titled in a very poignant way, Exodus. I'm not religious, but I quote the Bible. So I am going to think about the Passover story, and it always says that we should think that we have also been left Egypt, that we are exiles from Egypt. And the idea of the Exodus touches every human being. Some children feel that they have gone through an experience of displacement when they move neighborhoods. Ignacio and I are very good friends, and I think that we intuitively felt work on this project. Ignacio being from Spain, I am from Chile, from a long history of Jewish displacement, from the pogroms to the Nazis. So my whole life, I was surrounded by people that went from one place to the other, from cities that no longer existed. But I was so moved by their fortitude, so moved by their resilience. And the idea of this book really became so vivid to us in the sense that enough of hearing the UN Commission on Refugees, we just see thousands of people, bodies, images of boats sinking. And I wonder, does it mean something to our individual lives? And we thought, what would it mean to readers to think about refuge not only as a statistic in the media, as an ideology? In a way, you notice that this book doesn't have much the political ideology. It has to do with humanity, what happens with refugees when they live in camps, when they are displaced, what happens to their health condition. That's why we have two physicians in this collection, Julie Levison and Richard Mollica. And this was our aim, to move beyond the traditional view of what is a refugee and what is to be exteriorly and interiorly displaced.
Yes.
That's beautiful, Marjorie. Ignacio, do you want to say some words too about
Beautifully
this
put.
topic?
I'm not going to be able to say it as poetically as Marjorie, but then again, I'm not as good as a poet as she is. So thank you, Julia, for giving us the opportunity as well to talk about our book. I just wanted to point out what a very important thing that our colleague Anne Ashbaugh was saying before when we were chatting, right? That what makes this book perhaps a little different from the others on the topic is that we're emphasizing the humanities approach, how very often the humanities are left out of the conversation on topics such as environmental humanities or refugee studies, when in reality a change of philosophical approach may be as important as policy changes, as sociological studies and approaches. And one example is, for example, the idea that a horizontal hospitality approach is better than thinking about charity and donation. For example, with the Scholars of Risks that we had a conference last week with that Julia organized with me and other colleagues. So instead of thinking about charity, saving these people, we are collaborating with them. We are giving them an opportunity to continue their research and their teaching in our campuses, so that when they hopefully can go back to their countries and their local academia is not completely destroyed. So this type of philosophical approach, where you change in the way you think about helping or collaborating or being hospitable to refugees, is extremely important. And we as faculty have the unique opportunity to help them in their careers, right? Because I mentioned in Irvine the other day how one of the donors for Scholars of Risk mentioned to me, why me? Why do I have to give you money? Why not the US government? Well, we all have to do our best. The government is trying, but we as professors, for example, are the ones who have the opportunity to give them these colleagues in risk and inroad into our campuses to continue their research. The government is not doing it. So this accepting the future of others as our own is an important change of mentality that we're trying to convey through this book. And Anne, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else.
Yeah, Anne, did you want to add to that? We can't hear you, Anne.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. I just wanted to add that in seeking and in giving sanctuary and responding to others who need of refuge, we are actually affirming our common humanity. So in that sense, in any way in which the humanities are linked to that affirmation, that this book is saying, that's the therapy that we need. We're offering this, the healing of humanity that has separated us and divided us so far apart that we become indifferent to the suffering of others.
You mentioned healing, and that brings me back to one of the distinctive features of this book, which is the inclusion of medical and medical humanities perspectives. Can one of you address how that came about, how you engaged people in these fields, what you were trying to accomplish there, and maybe just some details that you learned from that exchange?
I think I'll answer then, Ignacio. First of all, I'm very grateful to see my students in as listeners as join the webinar, and I'd like to say that the two physicians are one is a former student of mine. I'm very proud of her, Julie Levison, and her initial medical research began with AIDS patients, and she always thought that the people that have AIDS, the majority then was the gay communities, were displaced, were refugees in their own countries, where no one really paid attention except this wonderful Dr. Fauci that other people don't like, but I love. And he was very, very instrumental in helping find some kind of cure for AIDS. So there is a disease that associated with the stigma of being the other. And this is what Anne, you really talk about. And I'm also very fortunate to work with Dr. Richard Mollica, one of the leading experts on refugee studies and trauma. And you can look up his wonderful program, Harvard program on refugee and trauma. And he always taught all of us that each refugee has a story, has a narrative. And the only way you can really heal is not only through pharmaceutical, but is through the connection with the world you left behind, the connection with familiar words, familiar scenes. He worked a lot with Cambodian refugees. And once he told me about a very special exercise that he had a bird in a cage, and the Cambodian refugee talked to the bird, and then it opened the doors, and the bird was free, and so was the refugee. So we learned that symbolic understanding of our world is so essential, not only political, not only ideological, but he believes that poetry truly saves people. And I'm very, very proud to be the poet laureate of this organization. I don't know what it really means, but I am proud of that they have chosen me to be the poet laureate. So we invited them, and they, of course, immediately agreed to participate. And our student, former student, Julie Levison, she's also a wonderful poet. So I think that what she learned at school, at Wellesley College, at Harvard Medical School, made her a researcher and a deep humanist.
Yes, if I may add something. So, Julia, the idea of including the medical humanities I guess, responds a little bit to the concept of the books, right? So it's not a typical critical refugee studies book. It combines philosophical and theoretical approaches to the concept of refuge and refugee, as well as practical approaches, right? So I would say, this is the book, by the way. I don't know if you guys can see it. And there's a beautiful article, The Shamanistic Enclave, Building a Refuge for Healthcare Practitioners, by Richard Mollica, Maria Leister, and Laurie Charles. And if you read that book, it has nothing to do with refugees coming to the United States or anything like that. It is precisely what does the concept of refuge mean for medical practitioners in times of COVID-19, where they're working nonstop and they're running out of energy, and they resort to again, going back to the humanities, right? To the idea of learning from Native Americans, how they recovered after war, and Asian communities, how they recover from trauma, and building this shelter, right? This refuge where they call it shamanistic enclave, right? Where they can recover themselves. So it can be finding refuge for political prisoners in Chile through music, finding refuge in literature from monks in the 17th century. All these approaches were important for us, right? We wanted to write a book that was both academic in approach, but also for our general readership. And I think the combination worked pretty well, right? You can, I think, Anne Asbaugh's beautiful essay would be more into the philosophical, theoretical approach. Others are more just as they are in medical humanities, right? A narration of your own experiences as a medical doctor and how you survive COVID-19. I see that my colleague Cristina Lux is in the audience. We, along with our colleague Dalia Magaña, just co-edited a book on medical humanities, and this is also the approach, right? How are the humanities going to help in environmental studies, in the medical field, in refugee studies? There's a lot we can contribute. And unfortunately, only lately we have realized that we cannot be left out, that these philosophical approaches in how people conceive the medical profession, the environment, and refugees, and the refugee problem are very much down our alley. And Anne, I don't know if you wanted to add anything?
No, I'm okay now.
And I encourage our audience to please post questions in the Q&A. And I know that our speakers would love to hear your own thoughts and responses to what we're talking about today, which is so important. I was really interested in what I think Ignacio said a few minutes ago about hospitality being a lateral, a reciprocal, a horizontal relationship. And of course, hospitality is a big part of ancient Greek literature and philosophy, which I know Anne works on. I wonder if one of you would like to comment about the affordances and power of hospitality, as well as perhaps its limitations in thinking about refuge and refugees.
Yeah, so the concept of horizontal hospitality, unfortunately, is not mine. I borrowed it. But the idea is, you know, these people are helping us. The University of California, for example, we're not trying, again, to participate in a brain drain, but they bring their knowledge here to their research, their teaching approaches. We brought, as you know, a graduate student to our graduate group who's bringing a different lived experience from being a refugee from Afghanistan. So the idea is, again, accept that this could be your experience too. I mean, my own parents lived during the Spanish Civil War. My dad lived in a cave. I'm not that far removed from this kinds of experiences of war and suffering. And we need to realize that we need to see them as our own. These peers, these academics that come from other countries, and we help through Scholars of Risk, are our people too. We could have the same experience. So practices that provide welfare, safety, beyond what the government can provide. I think these are the building blocks of civil society, and we really have to approach it fairly and being saviors of these people, which I really hate that idea. So that's why I was borrowing that term, horizontal hospitality.
That's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Go
Go
ahead, Anne.
I was going to add to that, that the denial of sanctuary, the denial of refuge, dehumanizes the people to whom it is denied, but it also deprives the denier of a richness of resource that they would never acquire just by staying with close borders.
Yeah, that's really beautiful.
Julie, I like to thank you, Anne. It's beautiful what you have said. The denial of refuge so undermines the denier, its humanity. But I would like to follow what Ignacio says. I think that this is a teaching moment for the world, especially for the West, for our students, not to think as the refugees as others, but to feel a profound empathy for what they're going through, for what they left, for the imagining a new world. And I like to pose this to the audience or for further thought. You know, we receive Scholars at Risk, and I think it's a wonderful initiative of so many universities. But what have we done as a country in the United States to give refuge? We know that for Jewish refugees or other refugees in World War II, it was very, very minimal. We don't receive so many Ukrainian refugees. We don't receive Syrian refugees, Turkish refugees from the earthquakes or in general. Afghanis, we've left them alone. So I'd like to just say that this country is not exceptional when it comes to refugees or refuge. And it will be very interesting. This will notice that in this book, we don't speak about the political complexities of the refugees that are coming from Central America. Yael touches upon this, but we've done so little to help others. It's a myth and deals with myth. And I think this is why I think Ignacio and I feel the same, that we had an urgency that this book had to be done, that we can contribute a grain of sand to the great human displacement of the 20s and the 21st century. And if we can change a person's mind, if we can convince a student to become an immigration lawyer, a doctor, a healer, we've done our job. But we are in the midst of a global crisis, and all what we do is photo opportunities to see how great we are. But I like to say that we have done very poorly compared to the rest of the world.
I think you make the point in the introduction that most refugees are actually not coming to America or Europe at all, to the global north, but are actually in the global south, sometimes as internally displaced people in their own homelands. And so there's a very skewed picture, I think, for a lot of Americans of where refugees are and which countries are the major sites taking on this responsibility, often with minimal assistance. So I think that perspective is important too. The geography of displacement, if one looks at it globally, is not what the American media presents it as being.
It's often the neighboring countries, right, in the global south that take the biggest number of refugees, and the generosity of some very, very poor countries is astonishing, right? And even in Europe now, right? Poland has given a great example, I think, of the generosity in receiving refugees from Ukraine. I agree with Marjorie. I think the US and Europe in general could have done and could be doing much more than we are. And it's in a way sad and selfish that we're not.
I have another question for you that's a little bit different, which has to really do with gender and the role that women and children, orphans, unaccompanied children, what role they play in mass migration, also in acts of hospitality and the offering of refuge. I know, many of the faith-based organizations that are involved in hosting refugee families, it's often women who are taking the lead in the fundraising and the problem solving and the locating of pots and pans and the Amazon registries, the sort of all the kind of detail work that goes into actually hosting just one family in a local community for a period of time. And so I was wondering whether any or all of you wanted to address the role of gender, social reproduction, sexual reproduction in the many sides of refugee work, of resettlement, etc.
Well, maybe I'll start briefly. I hope we all agree that there is a war against women all over the world. In the US, there is a war in Iran, a war in Afghanistan, and there's really women, I would like to say, that really suffer extraordinary hardships. First of all, there's so many women that when they become refugees, they are displaced. They are usually walking from one country to the other. A lot of them, not many of them, are pregnant. They give birth in a strange environment without knowing the language. Just imagine that. We get upset when we cannot get a doctor's appointment in America, but look the hardships one single woman goes through. Maybe she has other children. Maybe her husband is missing. That's one thing. The biology of women is affected tremendously. Of course, there's rape. Of course, there's human trafficking of both men and women, but the majority are women. And homes are very important to humans, but homes are very essential to women. The cooking, the kitchen, the beauty, to have a flower pot. And when all this is missing, what do you do? And how do you feed your children? And in what language do you speak to them? And what stories do you read if you have no books? And where is your grandmother and your mother that could guide you and advise you? So the world of women shatters, collapses. So gender and the politics of gender plays an instrumental part in this. And also, I'm thinking about Yael's article, displaced women are searching for their missing children, their missing husband. That is also another extraordinary burden that we really have to think about. And let us say, what happens to children in the US border that are separated? What is the mother going to do? Where is she going to look for? In what language? Does she have enough of the empowerment to seek help? In most cases, no, their integrity has been destroyed, diminished, their souls. So I do think that gender plays a key role in this displacement movement.
And Anne, from your perspective as someone who works on the classical tradition, do you want to comment also on the role of gender?
Yes, what I'll go at it in terms of their mythologies, because part of what I try to do is look at the underlying mythologies that have been foundational for the values that have been accepted in the West. And if we go back, I take it back to Genesis. And so in a way, I'm answering one of my questions a little bit in advance, because part of what happens is that we've got part of the mythology to support our common humanity, because we all said that we're all created from the same, right? So there's one God that creates and all people to his image and likeness. So that should create kinship, that should create union, that should make all of us human beings quite all right. But the problem is, the way I put it is, the human family becomes dysfunctional the moment that we introduce hierarchical thinking. And the hierarchical thinking comes immediately by having the male created first, and then the human as the one that is going to have power to name the animals and power over the earth. So the moment we have a hierarchy, then we have better and worse than better and so on. So the male becomes primary, the female becomes secondary, she becomes then the temptress, and there is an animosity towards the female factor in the West, to the point that there was even a council of the church in the 300s, trying to decide whether women were human or not. So the humanity of the woman became questioned. Why? Because there is already a hierarchy within the mythology that allows a place to put those that we devalue. We animalize them. So we say, no, women are not human, or they're only partially human, but they had to vote. And I always say that the vote went for women because men couldn't figure out how they were going to explain that they were practicing bestiality and that they were born from an animal. So anyway, that's just being a little bit cynical. But the point is that the hierarchical way of thinking is endemic to the basic fundamental mythology that has been absorbed for supporting our values. So when we go backwards, there's nothing to stop us from undermining another human being by turning them into pests. In the notion when Luther writes the letters against the Sabbatarians and says the Jews have to be exterminated, like we exterminate pests. So there's a reduction to the animal. But if we take out the notion of hierarchical thinking, if we see all living beings to have value, and value that is comparable, value that is all, that cannot be eradicated, then we get rid of that problem. And that's part of what I was trying to work out. How do we get rid of the dysfunctionality of the human family that is supported by the Genesis myth?
Thank you. That's really interesting. We have some questions here from the audience. Sophia Yates has a question that's really directed to this gender issue that we've just been addressing, but taking it from a more legal point of view. She asks, do you think that the limits of the legal definition of refugee and the requirements for those seeking asylum, fleeing discrimination based on membership in a particular social group, do these definitions and requirements fail to protect women, especially those who may be fleeing domestic violence? And if so, what can and should be done to rectify this?
This is a student of mine in our class. Very complex question, Sophia, but Ignacio, do you want to start first to answer, Sophia?
So this type of question unfortunately goes a little bit beyond the scope of our book, because it will be policy change, and that's not something we address. But of course, as your teacher, Dr. Agustin, mentioned, intersectionality is an issue that affects refugees directly. Rape has become, unfortunately, a sort of tactic of war. Human trafficking affects women much more than men. And in these societies where refugees are coming from, very often women are the backbone of society. So helping them first should be a priority in order to also support the families, right? But there's not something that our book approaches directly that I recall. So I don't have a more straight answer, unfortunately.
And Sophia is a wonderful student because she has a second question as well. And this is something I think you do address, at least briefly, in your introduction, which concerns the specificity of the Latin American case. Given the impact of US intervention in Latin America in producing the circumstances that have led to a lot of forced migration and displacement, does the US have a greater obligation than other countries to address the crisis? And what does or should that obligation look like?
Yeah, I would answer to that yes, and that there's a model, the model of reparation. We have several models because there have been cultures that we destroyed. We destroyed the Native American culture. Well, we emaciated it. And there's a model of restoration there, and there's a model of restoration that is now being forged gradually for African Americans because of the dissolving of their lives by capture and slavery. So I would say that the path of reparation is one that has some steps towards it, but it's very, very difficult to bring about. Marjorie?
I'm very proud of, I'm thinking this is why we teach. I'm thinking a lot, Sophia, about your question. And I agree with Ignacio that we didn't touch upon this because this book doesn't really address the legalities of the issue of refugees. But I like to share this idea, Sophia, with others that we may have the right law, you go to the bathroom, says don't discriminate women, gender, transgender, but the fact is that we do. So there is the law and the lack of implementation of this law. Yes, wonderful free education for everyone. We know that if we live in privileged towns, we will be educated. So again, how do we implement these laws to protect people, and in this case, to protect women? I think the US, unfortunately, it's a country we all live here, we admire, we even love, has failed in reparations. Only now, perhaps, they are thinking about reparation for the African American community that were brought as slaves. There are no reparations for the 1 million Chilean exiles that left due to the coup that was staged by Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. No reparation for El Salvador, for Guatemala. Who is involved in the greatest function of drugs? The United States. Women suffer a lot as victims of the drug cartels, and then they become displaced. So I just think that it will take a new generation of people, a new generation of students to accept the responsibility of the United States towards the whole world. Let's face it, we have entered wars, World War II, when it was really too late. And this is Samantha Powell's idea that we always enter a crisis when the crisis has taken place. Genocide, Report from Hell, one of her books. So I do believe there is an urgency for accountability for the United States policies in East Timor, in Chile, in Afghanistan. Look what happened. People were held into the wings of a plane. Why do we have to see these images? Where is the idea of freedom? So let us hope for better tomorrows. And, I'm going to quote Barack Obama, it takes audacity to hope. And we have to become audacious optimists.
Yeah, at the risk of repeating myself, I go back to the same idea. History, the humanities are very important. If The US general population does not understand that when you fund wars, when you fund military coup in Argentina, in Chile, in Uruguay, in Central America, and fund civil wars and contras, you are creating refugees. You are therefore responsible for their well-being and accountable for the outcomes of this little civil wars you create all over the place in support of military dictators. So the answer is absolutely yes. We are responsible. The US is very much involved in the situation in El Salvador right now with where did the gang members that almost took over the country until recently coming from LA and Southern California. So we cannot turn our back. It's extremely important to change the philosophical approach and the knowledge of the general population of this country, and be aware that when you fund wars and civil wars and you destabilize countries, you will have to deal with the refugees you've created.
That's really powerful. And we have a comment here from Azra Mukanovic, who writes, as a refugee from Bosnia, I want to thank the panel for such a compassionate and kind approach to refugees and our experiences. So I wanted to share that with you. I have a question here about imagination, and Marjorie, all of you are imaginative, but Marjorie is our poet here. In a world with walls, what is the power of imagination when thinking about refuge?
I think, and Anne and Ignacio can also answer this, I think imagination is about freedom. And freedom to reimagine a different world. And it works. And people in the most adverse of condition, in refugee camps in Cambodia or in the West Bank, there's an article about Gaza by Sarah Roy. People in Auschwitz, they drew amazing paintings, they wrote diaries. Imagination also has to do with creativity and with the wondrous power of language. Sometimes people, women in refugee camps, become mute. Not only they cannot speak, but they cannot write. So imagination allows you to be in contact with part of your soul that has been so brutalized. And imagination will rescue you. And I like to end this very moving idea about imagination with some of the words of Salman Rushdie that I heard in NPR. He said, after the void, after the rubbles, after nothing is left, we will have words. So people that don't believe in the arts are mad. And people that don't believe in the possibility to dream the words of crisis are bureaucratic realists. We have to move away from accepting a reality that dehumanizes us. And this is where imagination comes from. And if it were for the drawings of Da Vinci and Michelangelo, there wouldn't be planes or the beautiful statue of David. So books matter tremendously. Books are part of the democracy of the planet. And refugees don't carry books, but they carry poems. They memorize poems. And each of them carries a story that will help them find refuge somewhere. And if it's not a physical place, it will be in their imagination.
That's beautiful.
Julia, if you remember at Irvine, the conference last week, Shiraz Nurami, the graduate student from Afghanistan that was there, when you asked, is there anything you want to add? I thought it was really beautiful when he answered with a poem from an Afghani poet, and it was so moving, right? That he has brought that to the States with him, and it's like an anchor that's helping him survive, right? I thought that was beautiful.
Oh, thanks for reminding me of that. That was very powerful. And for our conference, we invited everyone who participated, which included scholars from the UC, scholars at risk being hosted here, scholars at risk from other campuses on the East Coast. And people were invited to define what refuge meant to them. And we had a slideshow running with the various answers. I wish I had them at my fingertips because some of them were quite moving and profound. And the ones that responded with poetry, of course, touched me as a literary person, but I think also touched those who were reading the slideshow and these testaments over the course of the days that we spent together. So thanks for reminding me of that. That's really, really great. I have a question for Anne. You talked about negative mythologies and how those shape how we treat refugees. You work on ancient philosophy, which was coming out of, a mythological world while also kind of pushing back against it in some ways. Can you comment on mythologies that you think are helpful? I mean, every mythology is going to have constraints and affordances for thought, and we don't want to damn some and praise others without being subtle with how we think about these different traditions. But as a philosopher, can you comment on mythologies for our time that nonetheless hail from the ancient world?
Yes, I in fact teach a course on finding ourselves through myth. And one of the powers that I have found is in Greek mythology is the power to allow us to discover who we are in the process of engaging with what's happening in the stories themselves and how we are appropriating them. But I was going to say that perhaps the most powerful expression of mythology for transformation of society is Greek tragedy. Because what Greek tragedy allows us to do is to experience and confront suffering right in front of our faces, right as an experience, not just as an idea, but as an experience of suffering. And if we see, for example, the tragedy of the Trojan women, which is Euripides' tragedy, what you find is that you have this moment at the beginning where, in fact, the Trojans are defeated, and then the woman sees a child. Her child is removed from her and is destroyed because he would have been a future king. And people say, well, that's so gory, that's awful. No, if we confront that and if we face it, what we are experiencing before us is the horror of war. And we are able to say, oh, okay, if I'm going to vote, if I'm going to take a vote in the assembly in support of war, I have to remember Euripides, what I learned with Euripides. Because for the Greeks, the Greek tragedy was an experience that allowed them to anticipate outcomes. So that the Greek tragedy and the myth in tragedy support democracy. Because they are educating our heart. So part of the problem is that we're always thinking about changing people's minds. But the way to the mind is through the heart, through the feeling, through the experience. And that's what Greek tragedy provides and mythology supports.
That's beautiful. I'm sure that you're aware of the Theater of War group that does these really fascinating restagings of mainly classical tragedy, often engaging veterans. Their more recent series, sort of during the COVID era, has engaged nurses. They have this Nurses Antigone project. And I think that group is so powerful for bringing the classical tragedy, into our current space engaging communities and non-actors in the power of drama, and really kind of renewing those legacies that you were just talking about.
Yes, and actors are important because Greek tragedy was participatory. So you didn't
Absolutely.
have an actor.
Right. There was the ephebes, right, who were like the citizens in training, and they had to be the chorus. Like that was part of their civic training. It was talk about the power of the humanities to be, you know, an engine for citizenship. Very powerful, indeed. And then this question of the other and how the other is devalued, and the role that thought, that mythology, that literature can play in both creating the problems of othering, but also maybe ameliorating them. I wonder if any of you would like to address that issue.
I could begin a little bit because I was originally going to address it. The problem is that we've lost track of how, in fact, when we say other, we should be saying another. Because the other begins, is alien, is out there, is something I could be indifferent to. But when we talk about one another, there's already a conjunction. There's already a union. The other is not alien. The other is not someone that I can be indifferent to. The other is, in fact, a window, is a perspective, is an opportunity. So what we have to do is to overcome the fear of the different, which is what guides us and makes us vulnerable to those who want to push people towards hatred of those who come in as the other. So the notion is, oh, these people are going to come and take your resources. No, these people are coming to build a life among, and we're going to work at it together. So what we need is a transformation of the understanding of difference. And that is very, 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 very difficult. And we're trying. I think there are many things in place. Inclusion in universities has become a much more important office than it ever was before. But that's what's at the heart of it, is how do we conceive of the difference as something which is something for which we thirst, not something that we fear.
That's beautiful.
I would like to, since I see that two of my graduate students are here, Hugo and Violet, they may be interested in this. I just read a recently published article that is absolutely beautiful, and it deals exactly with this idea, who's the other, right? The other as a refugee. And I mentioned it earlier, it's called A Horizontal Hospitality, and it's by Guillermina de Ferrari. And I recommend you guys to read it. It was published in the Routledge Companion to 20th and 21st Century Latin American Literature and Cultural Forms, edited by her and Mariano Siskin. And her definition is both poetical and very much applicable and practical. So I highly recommend my graduate students to read that article on exactly this idea, right? Of why the other is more another, right? We're part of that other.
Beautiful, thank you. And we have a question from the floor. Jean Belviada asks, do some of the contributors to your book deal with specific refugee literature or other art?
I could answer that, but Anne, I think what you said has touched all of us when you said the way to the mind is with the heart. So we also need a transformation, a new orientation for our heart. And I think that literature and the arts does help alleviate human suffering. And I think this is why we hope that some of these essays will alleviate suffering. Hi, Jean and I are colleagues from the Boston area. I think that, and then Ignacio, maybe you can have the only article that kind of deals with incarcerated people, people that were not able to seek asylum within their own country. In the case of Chile, seek refuge. It's called, I think it's the article by Professor Cristian Montes. He writes. I would like to say this is more concrete refugee literature. I think antes que se me olvide, before I forget, it's a very moving article and a moving story about two Chilean women, one from the upper class, one not, who are held prisoners in Villa Grimaldi in the outskirts of Santiago. And they tell each other stories at night and they sing. And this is how they survive torture and confinement. And this is the only, there's a physical book. And if we expand this idea further, the article of Barbara Mujica talks about refuge in the convents. I think women, the majority of them also enter the convent, not for religious reasons, but to seek freedom. But I think those are the most concrete. And there's an article about written by Christian Zwick that also talks about the passages of Austrian refugees to Colombia, South America. And then I think there's like references to refugee literature. I hope Jean and Amanda.
There's one, Marjorie and Jean, there's one specifically on refugee literature, the one by Howie Tan.
Yeah.
He analyzes a couple of Vietnamese novels about Vietnamese refugees. It's called Refugee Racial Form, Vietnam War Legacies and Late Liberal Affects. Or affects, and that's the one more specifically on refugee literature. But then, as Marjorie mentioned, then there's the one by Barbara Mujica, deals with Santa Teresa's Las Moradas, and then Rocío Quispe Agnoli, writing a shelter, refugee, and poetic space in Hispanic women's writings, also deals with women's poetry dealing with the topic of refuge and refugees. So mostly those three articles deal with refugee literature. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, we're basically out of time. I want to thank our amazing panelists for contributing their wisdom, their time, their thought to this conversation. And I also want to thank the people who have gathered here to listen and contribute with your attention and your questions. It's been a very meaningful afternoon for me. We have a final question here. I don't think we have time to answer it, but I'm going to read it so that we have something to think about as we move into the evening. Forced displacement and refugeeism seems to be profoundly entangled with human existence and history. From a humanistic perspective, what is the future of refugeeism? Is it plausible to envision a future where the concept of citizenship is not structured as a process of othering? So that's a really, really profound and important statement. And then we have a thank you from Eliza Leal. Truly such an informative event. Could the articles mentioned be shared? Thank you, everyone. So we're happy to do that. If our speakers could send me links to PDFs or links to articles, we will send that out to people who signed up for today's event. So I want to thank everyone for your patience, attention, and interest in UCHRI, in Refuge in Words, in the scholarship that's being done in the UC system. And it was great spending the hour with you.